Imagine this. The world thinks geopolitics moves through speeches, sanctions, and summits, but real power rarely announces itself. It moves quietly. In early 2026, something unusual happened. The United States escalated pressure on Venezuela. Not through Congress, not through the UN, and not through its traditional allies. Instead, the first serious conversations happened elsewhere. Inside energy circles, inside shipping insurers, inside private meetings with oil executives. To most people, Venezuela looked like an old story. A collapsed economy, a weak government, a country already under sanctions. So when pressure increased, it didn't feel alarming. It felt routine. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because Venezuela was never about Venezuela. It was about testing the system, testing how markets respond when supply risk re-enters the conversation, testing whether allies push back or stay silent, testing how far economic pressure can go without triggering open conflict. And the response was clear. Oil prices reacted, currencies shifted. But politically, almost nothing. No emergency summits, no global outrage, no red lines. That silence sent a signal, not to the public, but to strategists. Because in geopolitics, silence is data, and the data said something important. The system could absorb more pressure. This is how major escalations always begin, not with war, not with bombs, but with normalization. When something that should feel destabilizing starts to feel ordinary, and once that threshold is crossed, the next move becomes easier. This is where analysts began asking a dangerous question. If Venezuela was move 1, what is move 2? The answer wasn't Iraq. It wasn't North Korea. It wasn't even China or Russia. It was Iran. Not because of ideology, not because of religion, and not even primarily because of nuclear weapons, but because Iran sits at the most sensitive intersection in the global system. Energy flows, currency stability, regional balance, and perception of control. Right now, Iran is under internal stress, protests across more than 100 cities, a collapsing currency, rising food prices, water shortages, and a population that is no longer protesting for reform, but for change. At the same time, Iran controls one of the world's most important choke points, the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of global oil supply passes through that narrow stretch of water. That means Iran doesn't need to fire a missile to shake the world. It only needs to create uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly what markets fear most. This is why Venezuela mattered first. Because if Iran becomes unstable, or escalates, oil supply becomes the pressure point. And every pressure strategy needs a backup, a buffer, an alternative supply. Venezuela is that buffer. This is not speculation. This is structure. Before pressure increases in one place, control is established elsewhere. Before confrontation, positioning happens. And before headlines explode, moves are already in motion. Most people miss this because they were laughing at headlines. But geopolitics doesn't care what feels ridiculous. It only cares what works. And Venezuela worked. That's why Iran is now in focus. Not as a headline, not as a war, but as the next pressure point in a system that is already under strain. And this is only the beginning. To understand why Iran sits at the center of this pressure cycle, you have to stop thinking in terms of enemies and start thinking in terms of systems. Because Iran isn't dangerous due to what it believes. Iran is dangerous because of where it is. Look at the map. Iran touches the Persian Gulf, the Caspian Sea, Central Asia, and the Middle East. It sits between energy producers, shipping lanes, and regional conflicts. More importantly, it controls behavior, not just territory. The Strait of Hormuz is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Yet through that narrow corridor flows nearly 1/5 of the world's oil. This means something critical. Iran does not need to win a war to disrupt the global economy. It only needs to signal instability. That's why Iran has always been treated differently from other sanctioned countries. North Korea threatens missiles. Iran threatens markets. And markets react faster than militaries. Now combine geography with timing. Iran today is under pressure from 3 directions, simultaneously. First, internal stress, inflation above 40%, the real collapsing from hundreds of thousands per dollar to over $1 million in black market rates, food prices jumping 70% or more. This isn't just hardship, this is loss of confidence. When people stop believing prices are temporary, behavior changes. Second, political erosion. The protests are no longer led by one class. Bazaar merchants, traditionally loyal to the regime, have joined. Students are active. Working-class Iranians are protesting survival costs, not ideology. That matters. Because regimes don't fall when protesters shout. They fall when supporters stop defending them. Third, external pressure. Sanctions haven't been lifted. Oil exports are constrained. Banking access is restricted. And now, intelligence sharing between the US and Israel has intensified. This is the pressure triangle. Internal unrest weakens control. Economic pressure limits response. External signaling raises the cost of crackdown. And into this environment, Trump's warning re-enters the picture. Not as rhetoric, but as constraint. When Trump says violence against protesters will have consequences, he's not promising invasion. He's limiting options. Crack down too hard. International response escalates. Hold back, protests spread. Compromise, authority weakens. This is what strategists call a decision trap. No move improves the situation. Every move creates new risk. And this is where comparisons to Venezuela become critical. Venezuela showed that economic collapse alone doesn't topple a regime, but it also showed something else. Once pressure becomes normalized, external actors stop waiting for permission. They move through leverage. Iran is now approaching that zone, not because the US wants war, but because the system is setting conditions where energy markets can be managed elsewhere, allies are prepared, supply shocks can be absorbed, and escalation doesn't look like escalation until it's too late. This is why analysts say Iran is not the next target. Iran is the next variable, a variable in a much larger equation about power, energy, and control. And when variables destabilize, systems respond, not emotionally, but structurally. Every major conflict of the last 100 years has one silent driver. Not ideology, not religion, not even territory. Oil. But here's the mistake most people make. They think oil wars are fought to take oil. In reality, oil wars are fought to control behavior. And Iran sits on one of the most powerful oil pressure points on Earth. Let's break this down calmly. Iran doesn't need to export the most oil. Iran doesn't need to fire a missile. Iran doesn't even need to block shipping. It only needs to threaten uncertainty around the Strait of Hormuz. That's enough, because markets don't wait for confirmation. They move on probability. Even a 5% chance of disruption can send prices spiking. And price spikes don't stay local. They hit fuel, food, transportation, inflation, interest rates, political approval. This is why Iran has always had leverage far beyond its economy. Now here's where Venezuela enters the picture. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Not Saudi Arabia, not Russia, Venezuela. For years, those reserves were trapped behind sanctions, mismanagement, and political paralysis. But recently, something changed. The US didn't go to Congress. It didn't announce a grand strategy. It quietly opened channels with oil companies. That detail matters. Because governments talk in headlines. Markets move through contracts. If Venezuelan oil begins flowing again under US-aligned control, a critical pressure valve opens. And once that valve opens, the leverage Iran holds through Hormuz weakens. This is not coincidence. This is sequencing. Stabilize alternative supply. Reduce oil shock risk. Tighten pressure elsewhere. This is how modern power works. Not invasion, not occupation, but insulation. Now add one more layer. China. China imports more oil than any country on Earth. A significant portion flows through the Persian Gulf, which means instability near Iran doesn't just hurt the West, it pressures Beijing. This is why China has quietly tried to broker calm between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Not out of diplomacy, out of self-preservation. And Russia? Russia benefits from higher oil prices, but only up to a point. Too much instability collapses demand. Too little keeps pressure manageable. This creates a narrow band where chaos helps no one fully. And that's the most dangerous zone of all, because in that zone, actors stop trying to win. They try to position. The US isn't preparing for a war with Iran. It's preparing for oil volatility with Iran in the middle. That's why you see quiet military repositioning, intelligence coordination, energy supply recalibration, public rhetoric without declarations, nothing explosive, everything preparatory. This is also why escalation doesn't look like escalation anymore. A tanker incident, a cyber attack, a refinery outage, a sanction tweak. Each one small, each one deniable, each one cumulative. This is economic warfare without uniforms. And Iran knows this. That's why it plays close to the edge, but rarely crosses it outright. Because crossing it triggers response. But staying near it creates leverage. Until something changes, and something is changing. Here's the mistake most people make when they think about Iran. They imagined collapse coming from outside. Airstrikes, sanctions, invasions, foreign enemies. But history tells a very different story. Regimes rarely fall because of external attack. They fall when internal pressure meets external timing. And that's exactly the phase Iran is entering now. Let's look at the internal picture, calmly, without exaggeration. Iran's economy is not just weak, it's fractured. The Iranian rial hasn't declined gradually. It has collapsed in steps. From 440,000 to the dollar to nearly 1.4 million. That's not inflation, that's confidence failure. When a currency moves like that, it changes behavior instantly. People stop saving, they rush to convert, they hoard goods, They lose faith in tomorrow. This is why food prices didn't rise by 10% or 20%. They jumped over 70%. And this is where protests stop being economic and become existential, because hunger doesn't negotiate. Now here's the most important shift that almost no one talks about. The bazaris. For decades, Iran's merchant class was a stabilizing force. They weren't revolutionary, they weren't ideological extremists, they were practical, and they were historically aligned with the regime. When the bazaris stay neutral, the system survives. When they turn, the system shakes, and today they are no longer neutral. Strikes, closures, silent non-cooperation. This is the same pattern seen before. In Iran, 1979. In Russia, 1917. In Eastern Europe, late 1980s, the middle economic layer disengages, not violently, not loudly, but decisively. Add to this another layer, youth. Iran's population is young, connected, educated, and deeply disconnected from the ideology ruling them. Slogans tell the story better than analysis. Neither Gaza nor Lebanon. My life for Iran. That sentence alone explains everything. It's not anti-foreign, it's anti-priority. People aren't rejecting identity. They're rejecting sacrifice without benefit. And here's the part that makes this moment dangerous. The regime knows it's weaker than before, which means it reacts faster, harder. Internet blackouts, mass arrests, force escalation. But repression works only when fear is greater than despair. Once despair overtakes fear, repression accelerates collapse. Now connect this to the external environment. The US doesn't need to invade Iran. Israel doesn't need to bomb Tehran. All they need is time alignment. Pressure outside plus unrest inside equals instability without fingerprints. That's why warnings sound strange. Trump didn't threaten war. He drew a red line around civilian massacres. Because that creates legitimacy for response if needed, not inevitability, optionality. And optionality is power. This is why intelligence sharing increases quietly. This is why statements are vague. This is why actions feel incomplete. Because the strategy isn't to break Iran. It's to wait until Iran breaks itself enough that intervention becomes necessary. That's the most uncomfortable truth. No one wants to own the collapse. They want to manage the aftermath. And that brings us to the most dangerous moment of all, when regimes still control weapons, but lose control of narrative, economy, and patience. That's when miscalculation happens. Not planned war, accidental escalation. Here's the truth most headlines won't say clearly. This is not about Iran alone, and it's not about Venezuela, and it's not even about Israel. This is about how global power is being rearranged, quietly, unevenly, and without a single declared war. What we're watching right now is not escalation, it's positioning. Every major power understands one thing. The world is entering a phase where resources, trade routes, and internal stability matter more than ideology. And Iran sits at the intersection of all three. Let's strip this down to structure. Iran controls geography that can disrupt global energy flows. It sits next to the Strait of Hormuz. It influences regional militias. It challenges U.S. dominance indirectly. But here's the catch. Power only works if the system behind it functions. And Iran's system is under visible strain. Not because of one sanction, not because of one protest, but because multiple pressures are converging at once. Currency collapse, food inflation, water shortages, youth alienation, merchant disengagement, external isolation. This is what historians call compression, not collapse, compression. The system still exists, but it has no room to absorb shocks. That's when small events cause large reactions. Now zoom out. Why does this matter to the United States? Because Washington doesn't need to defeat Iran. It needs to ensure Iran cannot shape outcomes during the next global realignment. The US is already stretched. Ukraine, Taiwan, Middle East, energy markets, debt pressures at home. This is why America's strategy has changed. No massive invasions, no regime change announcements. Instead, economic pressure, strategic signaling, proxy containment, narrative control and timing. Always timing. This is why Venezuela mattered. Not because of ideology, because oil still sets the floor for global inflation. Control oil, control inflation, control political stability. Iran understands this too. That's why it threatens the Strait of Hormuz. That's why it leverages proxies. That's why it resists normalization. But resistance costs money, and money requires trust. And trust, once broken, is very hard to rebuild. Here's the final uncomfortable truth. Iran is not facing a single decisive moment. It's facing a long narrowing of options. Every response creates a new problem. Crack down harder. More unrest. Open dialogue. Loss of authority, escalate externally, justification for retaliation, de-escalate, appearance of weakness. There is no clean move left. That's what makes this phase dangerous, not because war is guaranteed, but because miscalculation becomes more likely. History shows us this pattern repeatedly. Empires don't fall when enemies attack them. They fall when internal strain meets external opportunity. And no one announces when that line is crossed. It only becomes obvious afterward. This is why the next year matters, not as a deadline, not as a prophecy, but as a pressure window where decisions made quietly today define outcomes publicly tomorrow. And if you're watching carefully, you'll notice something important. The world isn't preparing for peace. It's preparing for instability management. That doesn't mean catastrophe. It means volatility becomes normal. Power becomes conditional. And trust becomes transactional. This isn't fear, it's structure. And once you see the structure, you stop asking, will something happen? And start asking, who is positioned when it does? That's the real question now. Here's the part most headlines will never show you. When pressure builds inside a system like Iran's, there are only three possible outcomes. Not opinions, not theories, historical patterns, and none of them are clean. Scenario 1, internal collapse without war. This is the outcome many people assume will happen, but rarely does. In this scenario, protests continue. The currency weakens further. Basic services break down. Elite factions inside the regime begin fighting each other quietly, not on the streets, but inside power circles. Security forces hesitate. Orders become inconsistent. Crackdowns become selective. This doesn't look like revolution at first. It looks like confusion. And confusion is deadly for centralized regimes, because once loyalty fractures at the top, control evaporates fast. But here's the problem. This type of collapse doesn't benefit the United States or Israel immediately. Why? Because chaos creates uncertainty, and uncertainty spikes oil prices, disrupts shipping, destabilizes allies. So while internal collapse weakens Iran, it also destabilizes the region. That makes this scenario dangerous but uncontrollable, which brings us to the second path. Scenario 2, external pressure forces, a controlled shift. This is the option power centers prefer. Not war, not collapse, pressure. Sanctions tighten, banking access disappears, energy exports get quietly constrained, elite assets abroad are frozen. At the same time, diplomatic backchannels open. Messages are sent, not publicly, not officially, but clearly. The message is simple: change behavior or lose control completely. This is where leadership transitions happen. Not through elections, not through coups, but through negotiated exits, internal reshuffling, quiet replacements. This is how systems survive without appearing to lose. And this is the scenario Washington is structurally prepared for. Why? Because it maintains stability while shifting power. But this path only works if the regime cooperates. If it doesn't. Scenario 3, escalation without intention. This is the most dangerous one, and the most misunderstood. This is not about a planned invasion, not about a declaration of war. It's about miscalculation. One strike too far, one proxy attack, one blockade, one assassination, and suddenly red lines appear after they're crossed. This is how wars actually start. Not because leaders want them, but because systems under pressure make bad decisions. And here's the part people underestimate. When domestic legitimacy weakens, external confrontation becomes attractive, because conflict redirects anger outward. History is filled with examples of regimes choosing escalation to survive internally, not to win, but to delay collapse. Why this moment is unstable. What makes this phase uniquely dangerous is timing. Iran is economically strained. The US is politically polarized. Israel is strategically alert. Oil markets are fragile. Global inflation is sensitive. There is no buffer, no shock absorber. Any move now ripples globally. That's why markets react to rumors. That's why oil spikes on statements. That's why language matters more than action. The system is tight, and tight systems don't bend, they snap. What this is really about? This isn't about Iran alone. It's about how pressure moves power without war, and how sometimes pressure escapes control. In the next part, we'll look at who actually benefits from prolonged instability, and why not all chaos is accidental. Here's the question most news coverage never asks. If instability keeps repeating, who profits from it? Because chaos at this scale is rarely accidental. It may not be perfectly controlled, but it is often useful. The first beneficiaries, energy power brokers. Every time tension rises around Iran, one market reacts instantly: oil. Not later, not after war, immediately. That's because Iran sits on the throat of global energy flow. The Strait of Hormuz handles nearly 20% of the world's oil supply. Even the threat of disruption pushes prices higher, increases volatility, transfers wealth upward, and higher prices don't hurt everyone equally. They benefit major energy exporters, trading desks, commodity hedge funds, strategic reserves holders. For them, uncertainty is not a risk. It's an asset. This is why prolonged tension, without full-scale war, is the ideal state for many players. The second beneficiaries, military-industrial systems. When instability doesn't resolve, budgets expand quietly. New missile defense contracts, surveillance systems, drone production, cyber warfare tools, logistics upgrades. None of this requires a declaration of war, just risk. Iran's pressure creates justification for more US bases, more Israeli defense spending, more regional arms purchases. And once budgets expand, they never shrink back. Conflict becomes normalized, not as war, but as preparation. The third beneficiaries, strategic rivals. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because instability in Iran doesn't just weaken Iran, it distracts the United States, and distraction has value. China watches carefully, not because it wants war, but because every hour Washington spends managing Middle Eastern tension is an hour not spent consolidating power in Asia. Russia understands this too. Pressure in one region pulls resources from another. That's not conspiracy, that's basic strategy. Why Iran is the perfect pressure point. Iran sits at the intersection of energy markets, regional power balances, ideological conflict, global trade routes, which means pressure applied there spreads outward, multiplies consequences, forces reactions. Iran doesn't need to collapse to be useful. It just needs to remain unstable, and instability, when sustained, reshapes global behavior. The hidden cost. Nobody tallies. Here's what never appears on balance sheets: long-term regional trauma, generational distrust, normalization of surveillance, erosion of civil liberties. When instability becomes permanent, exceptional measures become routine. And once routine, they're never fully rolled back. This is how emergency logic becomes governance. Why this phase is dangerous. The longer instability lasts, the more systems adapt to it, markets price it in, institutions build around it, policy assumes it, and once that happens, resolution becomes disruptive. Peace becomes the shock. That's the paradox. What this means. Going forward, Iran is no longer just a country under pressure. It's a node, a place where energy, security, politics, psychology all intersect. And nodes don't break easily. They transmit stress. Here's the part most viewers never connect. They think geopolitics stays on maps. They think wars stay in headlines. They think instability stays over there. It doesn't. Because when pressure builds at a global node like Iran, it leaks outward into daily life, quietly, indirectly, but relentlessly. How geopolitical stress reaches you. The first transmission channel is prices. Oil doesn't need to stop flowing for costs to rise. It only needs uncertainty, even rumors around the Strait of Hormuz. Raise shipping insurance, increase transport costs, push futures markets higher. Those costs don't stay with traders. They pass through. Fuel, food, electricity, consumer goods. By the time inflation shows up on shelves, the geopolitical decision was made months earlier. People blame governments. Governments blame markets. Markets blame global conditions. But the chain always starts with pressure points. Why inflation feels permanent. Now, this is why inflation today feels different from the past. In earlier decades, crises were short, responses were decisive, normalization followed. Now, instability is continuous. Iran, Ukraine or Red Sea, Taiwan tensions, energy transition conflicts. Each adds friction, not enough to collapse the system, but enough to raise the baseline cost of living. This is structural inflation, not temporary, not transitory, persistent. The second transmission, financial tightening. When global risk rises, capital becomes selective. Banks lend less freely. Investors demand higher returns. Governments pay more to borrow. This doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like loans harder to get, interest rates staying high longer, fewer second chances. For households, this shows up as higher EMIs, credit limits shrinking, savings losing real value. Again, no headline, just pressure. Why governments feel stuck everywhere. This is why governments across the world sound the same right now. Different ideologies, same language. We have limited room. We must be careful. Tough choices ahead. Because global instability reduces flexibility. Every crisis abroad narrows fiscal space, increases borrowing costs, constrains policy. Iran doesn't need to export war. It exports uncertainty. And uncertainty taxes everyone. The psychological spillover. There's another layer people underestimate: confidence. When the world feels unstable, consumers delay spending, businesses delay investment, hiring slows. Not because collapse is imminent, but because trust thins. And once trust becomes conditional, economic momentum weakens. This is how geopolitical tension quietly slows growth without a recession headline. Why this phase lasts longer than people expect. Because no single event resolves it. Iran stabilizing doesn't end it. Ukraine ending doesn't end it. One election doesn't end it. We've entered an era where multiple pressure points exist simultaneously. No global referee exists. Power is fragmented. That means stress doesn't disappear. It migrates. The big misunderstanding. Most people wait for a moment, a crash, a war, a declaration. But modern systems rarely fail that way. They tighten. Life becomes more expensive. Mistakes cost more. Recovery takes longer. And people feel it, even if they can't explain why. Where this is heading. This doesn't mean global collapse. It means lower tolerance for shock, faster reactions to errors, and thinner margins everywhere. Which brings us to the final question. What happens when populations themselves become the weak link? That's where systemic risk truly changes shape. Up to now, we've talked about states, markets, oil routes, military positioning. But here's the truth. Every government fears more than foreign enemies: internal instability. Because history is very clear about one thing. Empires don't fall when rivals attack them. They fall when their own populations stop absorbing pressure. Why governments fear their own people? More than war, external threats can be managed. Missiles can be deterred. Sanctions can be negotiated. Borders can be defended. But internal pressure? That's unpredictable. When people feel poorer each year, ignored by elites, trapped with no mobility, they don't need ideology. They don't need leaders. They just need one spark. That's why protests in Iran matter far beyond Iran. They reveal something every government is watching closely. How much pressure can people take before behavior changes? Iran is a case study, not an exception. What's happening in Iran isn't unique. High inflation, currency collapse, resource stress, water, food, energy. Young population with no future visibility. That combination has appeared before. Soviet Union, late 1980s, Arab Spring nations, Latin American debt crises. In each case, the regime didn't fall immediately. First, something else happened. Compliance broke. People stopped believing sacrifices would be rewarded. The 3 stages of internal stress. Stage 1, economic pain. Prices rise, wages lag, savings erode, people complain but comply. Stage 2, psychological break. Trust in institutions fades, slogans change, anger becomes moral. This is where Iran is now. Stage 3, behavioral shift, strikes, refusal, mass non-cooperation. This is what governments fear most. Not rebellion, withdrawal. When people stop participating in the system loses its fuel. Why authoritarian and democratic states face the same risk? Many assume democracies are immune. They're not. The form differs. The pressure doesn't. In democracies, polarization replaces protests, debt replaces repression, distraction replaces reform. In authoritarian systems, force replaces trust, censorship replaces credibility. Different tools, same outcome if pressure persists. That's why leaders everywhere sound defensive now, not confident, not visionary, defensive. Why Iran is especially dangerous for global stability. Because Iran sits at the intersection of economic stress, ideological rigidity, external pressure. It has fewer release valves. When such systems crack, they don't fail quietly. They export instability, refugees, regional tension, energy shocks. This is why Iran is watched so closely. Not because it's powerful, but because it's fragile. The unspoken fear in Washington, Beijing, and Europe. Here's what no official will say on camera. If Iran breaks internally, others will ask, why not us? That question spreads faster than any ideology. Why pressure is now the primary weapon. This is why modern power uses pressure, not invasion. Sanctions, currency warfare, narrative control, economic exhaustion. The goal isn't conquest, it's compliance without collapse. But there's a problem. Pressure doesn't stay calibrated forever. Push too hard, systems snap. Push too softly, systems adapt. Finding that balance is harder than fighting a war. The dangerous phase we're in. Right now, many governments believe we can manage this. People will adjust. There's no alternative. That belief has been wrong before because history shows populations tolerate pain until they don't. And when they stop, the shift is sudden. Not loud at first, but irreversible. Why this is the real red line. Not nuclear weapons, Not oil prices, not alliances, legitimacy. Once legitimacy erodes, power becomes expensive to maintain. And expensive power always seeks shortcuts. Which brings us to the final piece. What happens when governments lose legitimacy, but refuse to lose control? That's where history turns dangerous. If you remember only one thing from this entire series, remember this. Systems don't become dangerous when they're weak. They become dangerous when they refuse to bend. This is the phase the world is quietly entering now. Not collapse, not panic, hardening. What hardening actually means. When pressure builds and legitimacy erodes, governments face two choices. 1, adapt. 2, enforce. History shows most choose enforcement first. Hardening looks like tighter control over information, harsher responses to dissent, economic decisions focused on stability, not growth, foreign threats emphasized to unify populations, not because leaders are evil, but because they run out of room. Why hardening is more dangerous than collapse? Collapse is chaotic but short-lived. Hardening is stable and prolonged. A hardened system doesn't explode, doesn't reform, doesn't admit weakness. It just tightens. That's when mistakes multiply. Because when systems stop absorbing stress, they begin transmitting it outward. This is where Iran, Venezuela, and the US connect. Iran shows internal pressure. Venezuela shows economic exhaustion. The US shows global overextension. Different systems, same structural phase. Each is dealing with limits, but in different ways. Iran tightens internally. Venezuela fractures economically. The US projects pressure outward. None are collapsing. All are hardening. Why external conflict becomes more likely. Here's the uncomfortable truth. External conflict often follows internal constraint. Not because leaders want war, but because it redirects attention, it justifies control, it delays internal reckoning. This is why geopolitical tensions spike when economies feel tight, not loose. Why bigger war? Narratives are misleading. People expect declarations, invasions, clear enemies. That's not how modern conflict works. Modern conflict is economic pressure, proxy escalation, cyber disruption, resource positioning, narrative warfare. It's constant, but rarely declared. The real risk isn't world war. The real risk is miscalculation, when legitimacy is thin, tolerance is low, trust is conditional. Small mistakes create large reactions. A strike meant as a signal becomes escalation. A sanction meant as pressure becomes collapse. A protest meant as expression becomes revolt. Not because anyone planned it, but because buffers are gone. Why 2026 to 2030 is the compression window. This is why analysts keep circling these years, not as predictions, but as convergence points. Debt rolls over, demographics tighten, energy transitions strain supply, political patience thins, too many systems adjusting at once. History shows simultaneous adjustment equals instability. What this means for ordinary people. This isn't about fear. It's about awareness. In hardened systems, volatility increases, mistakes cost more, narratives matter more than fundamentals. People who expect normal behavior get confused. People who understand structure adapt. The final truth about power doesn't disappear. It diffuses, gradually, unevenly, quietly. That's what's happening now, not the end of America, not the fall of empires overnight, but the end of effortless dominance. And that changes how everything behaves. Why this series matters not to scare you, not to predict dates, not to sell doom, but to give you something rare, context. Because once you see patterns, headlines lose their power. You stop reacting, you start reading.